In the heart of Lancaster County, the peaceful rhythm of Amish life was about to be shattered. The first warning came with the distant rumble of motorcycles, a sound as foreign to the community as electricity itself. The Devil's Chain, a notorious biker gang led by Victor the Serpent Crane, had chosen this peaceful haven as their new territory. Rachel Yoder stood at the edge of her family's cornfield, her plain dress rustling in the wind as she watched the first motorcycles roar past their farm. At 18, she had never seen anything like these leather-clad figures, their machines gleaming with chrome and malice. But it was their leader who caught her eye, Victor, with his silver-streaked beard and serpent tattoo coiling up his neck, his eyes holding a darkness that made her shiver. The gang's arrival brought immediate changes. They set up in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town, turning it into their makeshift clubhouse. The once quiet nights were now filled with the roar of engines and raucous laughter. Local English businesses began closing early, and even the police seemed hesitant to intervene, aware of the Devil's Chain's reputation for violence and retaliation. Stories spread through the community like wildfire: harassment at the market, vandalized buggies, threatening gestures toward young Amish women. The elders gathered frequently, their concerned voices carrying across candlelit rooms as they debated how to handle this modern invasion. Some suggested reaching out to the English authorities, while others advocated for patience and prayer, believing that God would provide a solution. Rachel's father, Jacob, seemed different from the other Amish men in these discussions. While others advocated for patience and turning the other cheek, something fierce flickered in Jacob's eyes. Rachel noticed how he would study the bikers when they passed, not with fear, but with a knowing look that she couldn't understand. His hands would tighten on his work tools, and sometimes she caught him staring into the distance, lost in thoughts that seemed to age his face. The tension escalated when Rachel began manning their produce stand at the local market. Victor and his gang made it a point to stop by, initially just to intimidate. But Victor's interest in Rachel grew more predatory with each visit. He would lean across the stand, his fingers brushing against her hand as he paid for apples, his whispered comments making her skin crawl. "Such a pretty bird in such a plain cage," he would say, his gang laughing behind him. "Maybe it's time someone set you free." Bingley would call out to the gang. Rachel's mother, Sarah, worried constantly about her daughter's safety. She had seen the way Victor looked at Rachel, the way his gang would circle their produce stand like vultures. Sarah suggested that perhaps Rachel should stay home, let someone else handle the market duties, but Rachel refused. "We cannot let fear rule our lives, Mom," she would say, though her own hands trembled as she sorted vegetables each morning. Jacob witnessed one such encounter at the market and stepped forward, his presence surprisingly commanding for an Amish farmer. "My daughter is not for thee to trouble," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made even Victor pause. There was something in Jacob's stance, the way he held himself, that seemed out of place in his simple black clothes and broad-brimmed hat. But the gang's harassment only intensified. They began targeting the Yoder farm specifically, spooking horses, damaging fences, leaving their mark. Late one night, Rachel found their barn door spray-painted with the Devil's Chain logo, a serpent wrapped around a broken cross. The sight of it against the weathered wood seemed like a violation, a piece of the outside world forcibly injected into their peaceful existence. The community rallied around the Yoders, helping to repair damage and offering support. Young men took turns keeping watch at night, though they carried no weapons and had no real way to stop the bikers if they decided to cause trouble. The bishops called for special prayer meetings, but even their fervent appeals to heaven seemed to fall on deaf ears as the harassment continued. Rachel began to notice changes in her father during this time. He spent more time in the barn alone, and sometimes she would hear him speaking English words she didn't understand, terms that seemed to belong to another world entirely. One afternoon, she found him holding an old leather wallet, staring at something hidden inside, but he quickly put it away when he noticed her presence. The situation reached a new level of tension when Victor began showing up at their farm alone, usually at dusk. He would sit on his motorcycle at the end of their lane, watching the house. Sometimes he would rev his engine, the sound echoing across the peaceful fields like thunder. Other times he would just sit there, smoking cigarettes, their orange glow like evil fireflies in the gathering darkness. It was beneath a man to sit in a house of 3 daughters when it was so dark that he could see the little ones playing nearby. Rachel's younger siblings, who had once played freely in the yard, now stayed close to the house. Her 16-year-old brother Samuel wanted to confront Victor, but Jacob strictly forbade it. "Violence is not our way," he would say, though his eyes told a different story. The peaceful farmer seemed to be wrestling with something inside himself, a battle that Rachel couldn't understand, but could sense growing stronger with each passing day. The breaking point came during the autumn harvest celebration. The entire community had gathered for a barn raising at the Miller farm, a tradition that normally brought joy and unity to their community. The morning air was crisp with the promise of fall, filled with the sounds of hammering, children's laughter, and women calling to each other as they prepared the feast that would follow the day's work. Rachel was helping in the outdoor kitchen, kneading bread dough alongside other young women, when the first distant rumble of motorcycles reached their ears. The sound grew louder, like an approaching storm, until the devil's chain roared into the Miller's farmyard, their engines drowning out the hymns and laughter. The children scattered like startled birds, running to their parents as the bikers circled the half-finished barn. Victor, clearly drunk and aggressive, dismounted his bike with an unsteady swagger. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Rachel, and a predatory smile spread across his face. The other gang members spread out, some grabbing food from the tables, others making crude comments to the young women. The community stood frozen, their peaceful celebration shattered by this invasion. "Quite a party you've got here," Victor called out, his words slurring slightly. "Thought we'd join in, share some of that famous Amish hospitality." He stalked toward Rachel, who stood her ground despite her racing heart. The dough on her hands suddenly felt like chains, keeping her rooted to the spot. "Your kind isn't welcome here." Samuel, Rachel's younger brother, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Several other young men moved to stand with him, though none of them had ever thrown a punch in their lives. "Samuel," Rachel said with a kind look in his eye. Victor laughed, the sound like gravel in a blender. "Your kind? And what kind is that, boy? The kind that thinks they're too good for the rest of the world?" He reached out and grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her roughly away from the table. "Maybe it's time we showed you what the real world is like." The flash of terror in Rachel's eyes was like a spark to dry timber. Jacob Yoder, who had been helping with the barn raising, moved through the crowd with a fluid grace that seemed completely at odds with his farmer's clothing. His presence commanded attention in a way that made even the rowdiest bikers fall silent. It tended to project a confidence uncanny around others who might be worried. "Release her!" Jacob's voice carried across the yard, but it wasn't the voice of a simple Amish farmer. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed, someone who had known violence intimately. Victor's grip on Rachel loosened slightly as he turned to face Jacob. "Or what, old man? You gonna pray at me? You don't recognize me, do you, Victor?" Jacob's voice remained steady, but there was something dangerous in his tone. He reached up and removed his broad-brimmed hat, revealing eyes that burned with an intensity that belonged more to the world of chrome and leather than to the simple life he'd chosen. 20 years ago, I rode with the Iron Disciples. They called me Silent Thunder. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through both the Amish community and the bikers. Rachel felt her world tilt sideways as she stared at her father. The Iron Disciples were legendary in the biker world, and Silent Thunder had been their enforcer, their justice bringer, before disappearing without a trace 2 decades ago. Victor's face went pale, his grip on Rachel's arm going slack enough that she could pull free. The older members of his gang began whispering among themselves, some backing away slightly. The name Silent Thunder carried weight in their world. Stories of a rider who could outrace anyone, who had never lost a fight, who had lived by a code that even other outlaws respected. "That's impossible," Victor stammered, but there was fear in his eyes now. "Silent Thunder is just a story, a legend. Every legend has its truth," Jacob said quietly. He turned to face his community, seeing the shock and confusion on their faces. "Before I found God's path, before I chose this life, I was a different man. I thought power and fear were everything, but I found something better: peace, family, faith." He turned back to Victor. "I chose to leave that life behind. But make no mistake, I remember every lesson from those days, and I will use them to protect my family, my community, if you force my hand." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The entire gathering held its breath, watching the confrontation between these two men, one who had chosen to leave the darkness behind and one who still embraced it. Rachel looked at her father with new eyes, seeing both the peaceful man who had raised her and the warrior he had once been, understanding for the first time that true strength could wear many faces. Victor, his pride stung but his bravado shaken, couldn't back down completely in front of his gang. "Prove it," he snarled, though his voice lacked its usual menace. "Prove you're really him. Anyone can claim to be a legend." The crowd watched as Jacob slowly walked over to Victor's motorcycle, his steps measured and deliberate. For a moment, he simply stood there, hand hovering over the handlebars, as if wrestling with himself. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the hushed farmyard. "The Iron Disciples had a saying," Jacob said, his fingers trailing along the chrome. "The road knows its own. Every bike has its own song, its own spirit. This one—" he paused, looking at the machine. "This one needs its timing adjusted. The carburetor's running rich. You can hear it in the idle." Victor's eyes widened. He'd been having trouble with the bike for weeks, but hadn't told anyone. Jacob swung his leg over the motorcycle with a grace that seemed impossible for a man who spent his days behind a plow. The engine roared to life under his touch, and what followed left everyone speechless. Jacob executed a series of complex maneuvers that transformed the powerful machine into an extension of himself. He rode with a skill that made the younger Devil's Chain members gape in awe, performing feats that seemed to defy physics. But it wasn't just the skill that proved his identity. It was the absolute mastery, the perfect harmony between man and machine that had made Silent Thunder a legend. When he finally brought the motorcycle to a stop, the silence was deafening. Then, in a move that shocked everyone even more, Jacob dismounted, walked calmly to Victor, and extended his hand. "There is a better way," he said softly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "I found it. Perhaps thee can too. The path of peace is harder than the path of violence, but it brings rewards that no amount of power or fear can match." Victor stared at the offered hand, his worldview visibly shifting. Here was a man who could have destroyed him, who had every right to seek revenge, instead offering friendship. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why did you leave it all behind?" Jacob's eyes softened as he looked at his family, his community. "Because I found something worth more than power. I found purpose, found love, found forgiveness." He turned back to Victor. "The same things you've been searching for with all this violence and intimidation." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but that moment marked the beginning of a profound change. Over the following weeks, the Devil's Chain, under Victor's conflicted leadership, began to shift their behavior. At first, it was small things. They stopped harassing the community, began keeping their distance. Then, gradually, something remarkable started to happen. One day, when the Stoltzfus family's barn caught fire, the roar of motorcycles heralded not trouble, but help, as the bikers arrived to assist with the bucket brigade. Another time, they helped search for a lost child, their motorcycles allowing them to cover ground quickly. Victor, especially, seemed drawn to the peace he saw in the community, often sitting quietly at the edge of gatherings, watching with hungry eyes. He saw her watch the kid's father sit. Rachel watched this transformation with a mixture of wonder and understanding. She saw how Victor's hardened exterior slowly cracked to reveal a man seeking something he'd never found in his world of violence and power. She also saw her father in a new light, not just as the peaceful man who had raised her, but as someone who had faced the darkness and chosen the light. Someone who understood the struggle between these two worlds intimately. The story spread beyond their community, drawing attention from other Amish settlements and even the English world outside. Some came to see the infamous Devil's Chain living in peaceful coexistence with the Amish. Others to witness the power of transformation and forgiveness. But what remained most powerful was the change within their own community. The incident had taught them that strength could come in many forms, that redemption was always possible, and that the greatest victory wasn't in defeating an enemy, but in turning them into a friend. They learned that their way of life wasn't strong because it ignored the outside world, but because it offered something the outside world desperately needed: peace, purpose, and belonging. Years later, Rachel would tell this story to her own children, not as a tale of bikers versus the Amish, but as proof that God's light could shine in the most unexpected places. She would tell them about Victor, who eventually sold his motorcycle and opened a small repair shop in town, where he would often be seen deep in conversation with Jacob, both men sharing the wisdom of their journeys. The Devil's Chain eventually moved on, though they were no longer the same gang that had arrived that summer. They left behind a changed community, one that had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith was seeing the potential for good in those who seemed the furthest from it. And Jacob? He remained the same humble farmer he had chosen to be, but now his quiet strength carried new meaning for everyone who knew his story. He had shown that true peace wasn't the absence of strength, but the wisdom to know how to use it. In the end, his greatest legacy wasn't the legend of Silent Thunder, but the example he set of a man who had found the courage to choose love over fear, peace over power, and forgiveness over vengeance. As Rachel watched her father working in the fields, she understood that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was not to fight, but to show others a better way. The peaceful valleys of Lancaster County had seen many changes over the years, but none quite as remarkable as the summer when two worlds collided and found, in their differences, a common ground of understanding and redemption.